I'm Diana Ideas, Master Certified Coach and Advanced Credential in Team Coaching, and I'm excited to talk to you today about ethics in group and team coaching. Ethics and excitement are not normally words that are combined together, but this is an interactive group. So this is a special interest group. So if you haven't joined us before, welcome. We invite you to fully engage. We're going to do a bunch of breakout rooms, and the hope is that you also walk away with best practices and in community, because so many of the challenges that we face as coaches, we often face in isolation. Sometimes we don't know what to do or say or how to handle something. And that is especially challenging when it comes to ethics. And then also from a group and team perspective, we're looking at potentially a lot of money on the table, unless you're doing it from a pro bono perspective. But even if you're doing it from a pro bono perspective, it's often, I call group and team coaching a rodeo because you're outnumbered. It's like 10 to 1 or 15 to 1 or however many people are in your group. I'm going to do a little foundation building because some of you may be very experienced in group and team coaching. Some of you may be new. Regardless of who you are and where you're coming from and whether or not you are familiar with group and team coaching, we welcome you. So welcome you to this community. As we know from a ICF perspective, that we treat our clients as resourceful and whole. So I also encourage you as coaches to consider yourself resourceful and whole. And whatever questions or things you do or don't know, welcome, and let's enjoy our time together and walk away with some awareness about ethics in group and team coaching. So a couple definitions to get us started, and I just pulled these off the revised ICF ethics. So the ICF just revised their ethics. They launched them on April Fool's Day, which is hilarious. But in the ethics, on the end of it is a glossary. So for those not familiar, external coaching is when you do not work for the company. Internal coaching is when you do. Group coaching is when it's similar goals, but team coaching is when there's a shared goal. So oftentimes, like I will group coach for the same company. It will be all the leaders of a certain level, or perhaps you have an open group coaching even within a company, as opposed to team is that intact unit. Any questions about the difference between these before we dig in a little bit more? Okay. So, speaking of sponsor lunch and learns, back in, I think, March, Jason Spector and I did Ethics Without Their Eye Rolls, Real World Coaching Dilemmas in 2025. So that is available. I'll get the link for that while you're in breakouts. That's available on ICFLA's YouTube or on the dashboard. So if you are not familiar with the changes that happen in the ICF ethics, we go into more detail on that. I have a short version on YouTube, or you can watch the longer version. If you not that not that you won't get enough of the time today, but at the same time, the ethics without the eye rolls, looking at, okay, what does this mean from the ethics changing and how does that impact us as coaches? So some of the revisions for 2025, in case you aren't familiar, is that there's more focus on core values. There's an emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There a change about it's not just about how you're operating in coaching sessions, it's about how you're operating as a coach and also other people within the ICF ecosystem. And then there's new ethical standards across technology and software. They don't get super specific, but they essentially say that it's your responsibility as a coach to make sure that the confidentiality that you use with your artificial intelligence or your technology is in alignment with the ICF standards. So this is with how quickly technology is changing, we may see an ethics update sooner rather than later, but this does put responsibility on the coach. So if you have interest in this or questions about this, or what software can I use or things like that, that's why I give a shout out to the presentation we did in the past, because there's more detail there if you want to go into more detail. Today, we're just going to look at the fact that, like, hey, how do ethics in general, but then also how do the revised ethics apply to team and group? So this is from the team competencies document, the ICF team competencies document. When I'm not screen sharing, I'm going to paste a bunch of links in the chat for you. So if you don't already have these documents. So some of you may be familiar with this already. So this is the portion. I'm just going to talk at you a little bit to build some context before we start and get into the breakout rooms and the case studies. So essentially what happens is in team coaching, there are these different modalities. If you're on the team coaching side, you're focused all the way to the right and really focused on how do we hold the team is its own unit. How do we, as coaches, hold the space for them to be their own experts? More than likely, if you're doing any kind of group or team work for money or in organizations, you're doing some hybrid of these. You may have a little bit, you may be facilitating an offsite, which might have some team building training, maybe a little facilitation, and then also some coaching in it. So what I appreciate is that the ICF actually acknowledges that, especially as team and group coaches, we have to wear hats or switch lanes, so to speak. But when we do demos and things like that, or when we think about this from an ICF perspective, we want to try to stay all the way to the right and be thinking about like, how are we holding this as roles as coaches? So for the case studies we do today and the breakouts we do today, be really thinking about how does this show up for me as a coach, as opposed to how does this show up for me as a consultant? And then these distinctions are identified. For those of you who are looking and pursuing the advanced credential and team coaching, this chart, there are a ton of questions on the team exam related to this chart. So this chart will be your friend, and I'll send you that link. But it's just, this is from the team core competencies per the ICF. And so what it does, once you dig past that initial page, is it basically takes the regular ICF core competencies, which are in the blue, and then it adds the team competencies in the orange. So this came out, I think, in 2020. So this is a couple years old. But what it does is it says, okay, all of the regular competencies that we have as ICF coaches still count. They're still valid. But then there are some components in here that get added. So the client team is a single entity, that distinction between the modalities. So that's what that chart was, demonstrating the understanding of when it is a blend, when our clients are maybe looking for consulting or team building versus just coaching. And then also definitely that last one is probably related to what we're doing in ethics today, maintains trust, transparency, and clarity when fulfilling multiple roles related to team coaching. So the challenge is that in our coaching agreements, and there's a puzzle piece for each of these, we won't go into it, but I want you to know where I'm pulling some of this information from in case you want to study deeper. But when we think about it, creating our agreements, when we think about establishing and cultivating trust and safety, when we think about creating that environment, that trust and transparency and clarity gets really complicated. And just so you know, in case you're not familiar with the document, it does go into more detail to say, hey, what did we add and what's the background on this? So I think it's like a 20-page, 20-page document. So if you're not already familiar with the ICF team competencies, I recommend it. If you're primarily a group coach, such as myself, a lot of them still apply. So if you're out there kind of doing this and aren't familiar with these documents, just to kind of ground us as we move forward. Speaking of, actually, I know I'm moving pretty quickly. Is there any questions or comments coming up for anyone before I get into technology and we start our breakouts? Okay. Okay. Stop me if there are. We're a small group, but even if we weren't, like this is your time. This is your learning time. Okay. So from a technology perspective and from an AI perspective, there are definitely benefits, right? The accessibility, documentation, different client engagement options, your ability to write summaries from your client. Like my mentees, I've started saying like, hey, do you want to turn on your AI note taker? It's actually really nice because it says like all the trends and my recommendations, and here are some of the takeaways. So there's definitely benefits on the AI side. The concerns and the challenges, I know some coaches are afraid, like, will AI replace us? Like, that's not my concern. I think it's more that lower level coaching. Some of the things like a colleague of mine was like, ask me a question you can't ask ChatGPT. And I was like, oh, that's a good question, right? Like some of the stuff that we would maybe get asked, like, do you have a resource for, or what are your recommendations about? Like AI can replace some of that. But what we want to make sure is that it's not replacing coaching presence and diminishing that human connection. But the creating privacy vulnerabilities is really the biggest place that we'll potentially look at today, because the privacy vulnerabilities that are created with AI and the AI note takers and is some, what's the sharing of information? What's the storage of information? Things get hacked all the time. This creates a privacy vulnerability for us as coaches and also for our clients that didn't exist a couple of years ago. It's turning up that kind of ethical heat when it comes from a technology perspective. So just to kind of create space, and these different slides are from that other ethics presentation, so you can dig into that if that's of interest. But I'm curious, like how people are currently using technology. Does anyone want to speak to that? Because then we can also make sure that we include that in the discussion. And it's okay if you aren't. That's not a pressure thing. It's just making sure that I'm making space for that.
Yeah, Diana, in my agreements, they can choose if they're okay with recording the sessions or not. Many of my clients are fine with that. And then I will take the recording, and I have an AI software that will transcribe it, which I use to send out my recaps.
Cool. Thanks, Terry. And paid, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's the difference for those of you newer to AI or maybe not dabbling. That's one of the key differences. There's different letters you can look for as far as the privacy. Be careful that you don't just scroll, accept on the terms and agreements for your AI. So do you make sure that you are protecting your clients? But that's most of the difference between the paid services, your clients are going to be protected, and the free stuff, that's going to be a risk. Which is why I also let for my mentees or for my clients, I let them do it. If they have a ChatGPT, if they use Claude, if they have an AI note taker, then my client is opting in. I don't have to send them the summary. They're doing that. So that's the way I get around it. And then I'll also say in my coaching, I've gotten good at delegating to people's ChatGPT. Like ask your ChatGPT this, and this, right? So this is part of our lives now. It's part of our coaching now. So something to think about. Thanks for sharing that, Terry. Anyone else want to share from a technology perspective? Okay. All right. So we're going to get into we've done a little foundation from an ethical perspective, from a AI and technology perspective, and also just building a little foundation from a team perspective. So we're going to do our first breakout. And just to give you a chance, take a moment to introduce yourselves. The coaching can be isolated. Often we're focused directly on working with clients, but we're not necessarily in community. So feel free to introduce yourselves. You can exchange LinkedIn or contact information if you like. You're going to be a bunch of breakout groups today, so you can also do that at the end if you prefer. But I want to give you some time to start to wrap your head around this. How do the ethics change? How does this impact external versus internal? And kind of what role technology plays as we're thinking specifically about team and group. So even though it's a coach faux pas to ask you multiple questions, I'm putting these questions out there so you can figure out kind of what resonates with you. I'm not going to give you too long in a group just because we do have breakouts for case studies. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll paste these into chat and I will put you in breakout groups. We'll just take 6 minutes to just kind of get this started, like get you talking to each other and get this started. And then we'll come back together. And then the rest of our time is digging into these topics a little bit more via case studies. Okay. Oh, and Eric, did you want to say more?
Oh yeah. I think I love asking like ChatGPT or Claude for just some like additional feedback if I'm just sort of brainstorming a couple of things and I just have different ideas. I just like to ask like a second opinion from it. And then usually if I agree or disagree with it, I'll make changes. So that's actually really helped me a lot in a pinch. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Great. Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say we had a big proposal going out, and what's great is Jason ran it through ChatGPT and it gave us a couple references for ROI on coaching. And you have to go check, right? It gets a little liberal. You have to go check the sources. But the proposal we put together, I think, was more compelling. So, one of the things we'll look at today is if or how does this impact when we're coaching a team or group? But that's something to think about as well. Even from a proposal and pitch perspective, there are ways that technology can serve us. Okay, so I'm putting these questions in the chat and I will see you in 6 minutes. Please turn on your camera if you're able and engage with your breakout. Hey, welcome back. Any burning questions or reflections that you'd like to share from your breakout with the larger group? And it's okay if not. I'm just creating space for it. Okay. Well, we're going to dig into the case studies, but be thinking about these things. We're thinking about the ethics. The case studies are specifically looking at external versus internal. And then the third one specifically looks at technology. So we're going to dig in. So in the case studies, essentially you just review the scenario and just discuss, think about the ethical challenges. And the reason I'm calling it scenario is because the case studies are just really brief. So some people like to call them scenarios. And then you're really just thinking about, okay, what are the ethics? What would you do as a coach? Are there questions that you have or any best practices that you would recommend? Because you're going to have a little bit of time in your breakout group, but then we're going to come back. You don't have to report back from what your group said, but at the same time, if you have questions or best practices or things aren't making sense, then this is a space, it's a safe space for you to share and for us to discuss some of those things. Okay? So this is going to hold for all of the case studies. There are 4 of them. If that feels like too many, just let me know and we will flex on that. But the first and foremost, so is a case study or scenario focused on group. So individuals sign a confidentiality agreement. There was a participant who had been open to sharing, but they seemed closed off. And then after they request a refund saying they know someone in the group and do not feel that they will be able to share. So I'm going to put this into chat. Feel free to screen grab it if you want to screen grab it so it's a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to put you into new groups and we're going to take about the same amount of time, just let you get your feet wet and start to discuss this in a new group. So thinking again about those questions, where are the ethics? What would you do? Questions and best practices. If you have any questions about this process, go ahead and linger back in the main room for a minute, and I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, I will see you in a couple minutes.
Diana, I have a question.
Please.
Is it possible to turn on the timer while we're in our breakouts?
You know what? I don't know how to do that, but I will make an attempt. And I'll give you a
Okay.
broadcast. And so we'll see if I can figure that out while you're gone.
Okay, and no worries, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask. Thank you.
No, thanks for asking.
This is exactly why I was hesitant. I want to put some parameters around that. And through our discussion, Yanni came up like, it would be great if there's transparent signups so people will know who's signing up to be in that group, especially for internal. Even though we're like 4,000 or 5,000 staff, they might know somebody through another work or program or whatever. So, and they don't want to be with that person in a group coaching scenario or session. Another one that we came up with is maybe also for me, since it's internal, put it through like a different levels of position. So like only supervisors can sign up for this group coaching session, or managers or individual contributors only here and keeping the group smaller. That way it's more manageable and less of a chance for it to go out of control.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is levels by level is absolutely my recommendation. It's why I prefer groups to teams. What I would say about transparent signups, I think that's a great idea, but also I think the challenge there is the vulnerability that someone writes their name on something. And where is that posted? And will other people look? And so some of like a lot of ethics, what we're talking about, it has to do with privacy. It has to do with privacy. It has to do with those cringy feelings, like, how do we make safety for people? And then also, I think what happens too, I'll just speak for myself, is that when you're coaching a group or team, regardless of what size, from like the cap for you to count it for your ICF coaching hours is 15. Most people won't brave 15 people by themselves, and they'll usually have a co-coach. But it from a diversity perspective, that's so many people thinking about things differently, communicating things differently. So we can't possibly see all of the things. So I just want to put that out there. But yeah, great ideas, Gigi. I just I throw a wrench in there just because I've run into some of these wrenches like once we were already signed.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we're in this session to talk about it, because I like the trend. I didn't think about, yeah, the privacy. People might not want other people to know that they're in a
Mhm.
group coaching session, but then how do you mitigate like the scenario
Mhm.
then?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to respond to that, but I'm curious if anybody else wants to share or
I
anything else
can,
comes up.
I'll hop in. Tracy and I
Please.
talked a bit about kind of more proactive mitigation strategies. The scenario was limited, but we were wondering if the coach had done anything to set the stage in the first session around ground rules, or if there was any trust building exercise just to even start to build relationship before getting into the nitty gritty versus just having the standalone confidentiality agreement. So we thought maybe just bringing the topic up proactively might help.
Yeah, great. Not
I
to
had a question.
oversimplify. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
I had a question around just the first statement of the coaching engagement. They're required to sign a confidentiality agreement. And I was wondering if that is actually like it has to be signed or can it be verbal? And just what that looks like. Because I think in addition to, I think someone before had mentioned about recording the sessions, I think I'm trying to figure out how do I position it and get approval from people to also post parts of the recording. So just wanting to kind of understand that route of starting with confidentiality and if there are any ethics around up to posting with their permission.
Yeah. Great question. So, in the spirit of ABC, which I know stands for always be closing, in coaching, as it's always be contracting. So you want to contract for the whole engagement, and you also want to be contracting for the individual sessions. As far as one of the first questions that came up, the way that my engagements are structured is that there's an intake assessment. There's a one-on-one at the beginning and the end, ideally in the middle as well. But there's a on the intake of like, how do you rate yourself? What questions do you have? What do you want to share with me as your coach? Blah, blah, blah. At the end, it says, signature or receipt of this document confirms that like you're going to speak only for yourself outside of the coaching agreement. So I would have it in writing, just Mona, because there's really nothing we can do from an enforcement perspective. So just to cultivate safety and trust, I would have either in writing or response to this email confirms receipt. And then to Kate's point, you do want to reinforce it because I mean, how many terms and agreements scroll, right? Like we're used to clicking stuff all the time. So you do want to kind of reinforce that. I always say speak only for yourself outside of the coaching engagement. So because I don't want someone to not share their amazing experience, but instead of me going out there and being like, oh, like Terry gave me this great idea. Well, Terry may not want to be associated with that idea. So I got a great idea from group coaching from one of the participants, blah, 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 so that I'm sharing and celebrating, but also it's personalized. Mona, I think the question about sharing is an interesting one. I'm just gonna say I wouldn't. But if you wanted to share anything, I would say do it after and get their approval after, as opposed to, because what I'll say for guest clients and things like that, sometimes I'll offer people a session and have it as a recording, but I'll also say to them, if there's anything in this recording that you don't want shared, you can redact that, because you don't want participants to hold back in the session itself because they're like, oh snap, I can't say this because it's recorded. But that might be, and then also, especially what you can do with video editing, you could potentially get like a super compelling clip that really doesn't reveal anything about participants at all. But I would make that a kind of add-on for after the fact, so that it didn't detract from sharing in the moment. Yeah. Okay. Good thoughts. All right. Well, just for the sake of time, I'm going to move us on. But no, I do encourage you. I will share my contact information with this SIG meets. We have another meeting in September and then one more in November. So, this feel free. We're starting the discussion, but know that we are not likely to solve all of these things today. So the next case study is about a team. So your team leader is highly engaged in team coaching, and they're the most frequent voice in the room. A few members of the team follow up with you expressing their concerns because they do not feel safe to speak up in front of their leader. They ask to remain anonymous. So this is wildly common. So want to give you some space to tackle this. Same questions if you want to scroll up: ethics, challenges, best practices. Just take some time I know it's short time in case studies, but just take a little bit of time to unpack it and the opportunity to meet a group of new people. All right. Thoughts, questions, best practices?
I have thoughts, Diana.
Please.
Yes. I kind of gave an example from like consulting world, but I kind of gave my perspective of, if the leader, let's say it's a VP, they want to be actively involved, let's say it's successions, if they want to be actively involved in all 6, I think the outcome from 1 to 6 will look very different if they're only strategically involved for like the first and the last, or just the first. And I think it's on us as the coach typically to just set that expectation up front before we begin. That way it's kind of still their decision if they choose to be really involved. And I know in this scenario that they are involved and people feel uncomfortable, but I think to mitigate that potentially, it's like having an upfront kind of alignment meeting with the sponsor, with the leader, and knowing that the outcomes will change depending on how involved they are, for better or for worse. But I think it's back on the client to choose that. So
Great.
yeah.
Yeah, and in the spirit of always be contracting, right? The more of this information you can front load at the beginning to say, this is how this works, this is what we expect, because, and the more experience you have, because, if you're new, you're learning along with them. But, it's interesting because I had someone be like, oh yeah, we don't need executive team sessions. We can just go with the rest of the leaders. And I was like, well, usually what happens if you do that is that they won't speak in front of you. So it's actually better if you have your own executive team. And they were like, oh, okay. But, it didn't surprise me that the executives who are focused on, okay, how do we make this better, want to lean in and engage that way. But also, if your boss or your boss's boss's boss is in the room, you're not going to share as freely.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? You're going to want to have a way to handle this. This is so common, right? Whether or not it's a team and it's the leader, whether it's just a group and it's a dominant participant, there is going to be someone in the room, even when you talk about laser sharing and share the mic and inclusivity and like all of the things, these are humans and there's a bunch of them. And so it's going to be common to have someone who might be more dominant. The challenge here is from a leadership perspective. This leader is just really excited and enthusiastic and likely has some blind spots because there's people that aren't sharing. So what I'll just share from my own best practices, I do share trends as long as they're anonymous. And I let people know that as long as trends are anonymous, I do share them. Usually I share them in front of the group, something that's come to my attention. You can also share and not be talking about that group. So sometimes when I coach leaders or when I coach teams, there's an imbalance of who's talking. Or for example, when you coach teams or groups, they often have the habit of all looking at you, the facilitator. So, it's just, you can share things without talking about that specific group. I do ask when people tell me stuff they're not comfortable with their leaders, I will say, like, do you feel safe to share? If I anonymize this, are you comfortable with me bringing this up with the group or me sharing? I will often ask, like, do they have any recommendations? What have they already done? So, we want to be encouraging ownership, because ideally in their work with us as a coach, we're building bridges in the relationship and helping them share with each other. But at the same time, also, since this is a team and it's an intact team and therefore has performance indications, we can't protect them. Right. And so there are reasons that whether it's demographic reasons from a DEIB perspective or from a just like workplace safety and culture perspective, there may be reasons that they don't feel comfortable to share. So, figuring out how we as coaches can potentially present the information for the team or group to process while still protecting the anonymity. I think it's really hard though when people have feedback and they want you to know, but they don't necessarily want it shared, because then you're aware, but the ethics and the confidentiality kind of catch you in the middle. What's coming up for you, Sarah?
I just have a question for you or for anyone who's done this, because I'm new. I haven't done team coaching.
Sure.
Do you ever have a conversation with the team leader before the coaching to say, people kind of default to the team leader, they kind of look to you. It would be good if you stepped back, even before you start the process, to talk about strategies to get more input by having the team leader not speak up, to intentionally decide, I'm not going to speak for the first, however long it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say, oh, sorry, did someone else want to, Kate, did you want to speak to that? Okay. I would say as much as you can build those in and as much as you can front load expectations, the better. You can always change things as we go. We have to pivot. But to say, when I work with teams, this is how many times I meet with the leader, or we're going to have a midpoint check-in. Because what I'll say for myself, I was coaching as an external, I was coaching a multi-level leader team. And the challenge is the people at the top were holding back because they were trying to make space for the folks that were frontline. And the frontline was holding back because it was like 3 levels of bosses above them. And because I didn't have any scheduled time to check in with them or follow up with them, I felt kind of awkward about reaching out and having that. So I think if you can front load that and put it in there, that's helpful. But it is important, especially if the leader, whether or not the leader is going to be in the sessions, to have those touch points. And then also maybe figure out if you have touch points, to Eric's point, without the leader present. Yeah. Roland, did you want to speak to Sarah's
Yeah,
question?
I just want to say that the main issue is lack of trust, and the team leader monopolizing the conversation is an effect of that. So the source here is not the dominance is the result. The source of the issue here is the lack of trust. So even if the team leader will step back, meaning will not quote unquote dominate, people will still not feel safe sharing. So I think that that's really the crux of the issue. And if we don't address that, the team leader can step back all he or she wants, but still people will not participate because they don't trust that whatever they say is going to be either kept confidential or will not be used against them and so forth. So the issue is how do you address the trust issue, not so much the dominance, given that if you address the trust issue, dominance will probably more likely take care of itself.
Yeah.
I
Thanks,
don't
Roland.
know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll stay.
Thank you for
I'll-
that.
Sure, I'll stay on this because I think Kate, did you want to speak, or I see you in the chat?
Yeah, I just was, it kind of piqued my interest when you brought up like, what if you're told something and someone's not comfortable? I mean, I'm in HR, and so coming from the coaching lens, from my HR lens, I can think about when certain concerns are brought up, we have to give voice to them, whether someone wants that or not. Where in coaching is the boundary for that? And I'm just thinking of like, do we have ethics in creating an effective coaching container or making it a safe space? Or is it truly just that, like those really extreme cases that we would need to highlight to a sponsor or someone else?
I think that's one of the challenges that it is exacerbated for internal coaches versus external. Because as an external coach, unless you're a mandatory reporter, the confidentiality of the ICF ethics is kind of law. It gets a little bit more complicated though, because if you're working with a big company, the big companies put you on their master services agreement. They don't sign your thing. So unless you're going to counter agree and put the ethics in there, that's become a little bit more ethically challenging from a contracting perspective. I think what's even harder for the internal coaches is what would happen for me when I was an internal coach is people would say something to me, not in a coaching session, but I'm an employee of the company. So technically, we as employees of the company are supposed to know, to Kate's point, like what we're supposed to report or not report. So it actually got very challenging for me. At one point, I actually reached out to my ethics professor, and my boss was, because I was the highest ranking coach, but I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. So I reached out to my ethics professor, and they do have an ethics hotline. That's one of the slides I'll show at the end, where you can even talk through with someone like, what am I supposed to do here? But the challenge is for the internal coaches, the more you can put that in, the more you can define those parameters amongst coaches and or who's managing you ahead of time, the better. But even when I was an internal coach, I was like, well, if someone wants to know who I'm coaching, that to me is that's against like my kind of ethics. I'm not sharing my notes, unless subpoenaed. So I was willing to lose my job over that. Thankfully, I was never put in that situation, but that also indicates a sense of financial privilege, right? In this market, someone might not be comfortable losing their job, especially because they work for a company. So Kate, I don't mean to just be like, hey, it's complicated as an answer to your question, but I think that that's some of acknowledging is, if you're going to coach employees, not just under your own, I'm working on my ICF credential banner, but if you're going to coach employees as an internal, as part of a coaching program, I think some of those things and what's confidential, what's not, are really important. So we would have it's not confidential if it violates company policy, blah, blah, blah. So like it can be a simple, and I'm happy to share that too. Like the agreement, Kate. So if that's helpful, but we had a kind of, just so you know, if subpoenaed, if you're in danger, if it's a violation of company policy, like then your coach is obligated to share. So it's just the language changes on those internal agreements.
That's actually super helpful just to even think about if that structure doesn't exist at an organization, maybe something to consider implementing. So.
Yeah. And for me, the structure didn't exist and we kind of fumbled into it and had to make it. So it can be helpful. And then yes, to Heidi's point, we don't have attorney-client privilege. So if subpoenaed, which I only know one coach who was subpoenaed, and then I know one coach who was asked to be a character witness. I know hundreds of coaches, so this is, not that common. But if subpoenaed, any notes you have, any information you have is no longer confidential. So that, your client's having an understanding of that. And that might be why you choose not to use technology that records and documents everything, because then you have a lot of information as opposed to If someone called me into court, the thing is that I have some clients I've been working with for years. So if I'm just keeping notes in the same Word document, at some point, like I may, the ICF, I think at one point even recommended, or maybe this is an assessor thing. Assessors have to keep their assessments for 6 months in case there's any verification questions, and then they have to shred the information. So that's another thing to just even thinking about is like, how are you, is expunging the word? How are you expunging your data? Knowing that it is your responsibility from a confidentiality perspective. But if something does happen and you do get called out, like what information do you want to keep?
Is there like a year limit on how long do you have to keep this information?
It's not there's not anything in the ethics.
Mm.
So I think the thing is I realize I had like a 6 month or year, but I think that comes from the fact that I'm an assessor, not as a coach. I don't think there's anything from a coaching perspective.
Right.
And sometimes here's the challenge. I have a client who their leader bought them a package of sessions, and we finished like their goals of the coaching engagement early. So then now over the past like year, they'll do one every once in a while. So it's actually super helpful that I have the notes from the original engagement, or that I have that in my memory, because this what we thought was going to be a 6 month engagement is kind of spreading out maybe over a couple years. But we just have to think about those things. That's sometimes the beauty of the ethics, and the challenge of the ethics is that it's not so crisply defined, but it's something that we want to reflect on. Okay.
And I just want to quickly hark back to the first, like earlier part of the session when you were asking like, okay, but this is an AI tool that you're paying versus unpaid. So the paid ones, from what I'm understanding from what you said, are more confidential towards the data privacy and stuff. Is that a suggestion that you made?
Yeah. So what happens with the free, I mean, you need to check because these things change all the time. And there's
Right.
some recommended tools versus others because there's acronyms you can look for and things like that. But if it's a free version and you are, say, working with someone with a startup, that information's open source.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if it's their AI or their note taking, it's fine.
It's fine.
But it's like that's why I let my client decide if they want AI in the session, because then I don't have to take on that responsibility as a coach. If you are using those features in your sessions, not as a coach, on your proposals and your notes and your descriptions and things like that, you're going to want to look at those terms. And there's a couple, I'll include the link. There's a couple recommendations of ones that, at least when we recorded those webinars and the videos, like it was like, hey, these are the ones to use. But there's new ones popping up all the time. But yeah, on the free version, you're running a risk that their innovation or their information is open source. So
Right.
that's actually a perfect segue into, we're not going to get to all the case studies, but that's a perfect segue into the next case study. Would you like to, for the sake of time, do y'all want to go into one last breakout group, or do you want to handle this one as a big group? No preference?
Well, I mean, maybe handle it as a big group because since our group is so small, even if we have breakout groups, we keep seeing the same people anyway. So,
Sure. Okay.
Just a suggestion.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to put this one in the chat and I'm going to share it on the screen. So this relates to the questions. Sorry, folks, I don't know what's going on with my computer today. Okay, this relates to some of the questions that you're coming up. So we have AI note takers in a session. Sorry, loading. AI note takers in a virtual session. You're internal. There's sensitive information in this session. Financial information. Sorry, folks. It's in the chat. Let me stop share and retry. So basically, financial information is coming up and it's going to affect the company's stock price. Now, you work for this company, so it's not any break of confidentiality that this is happening, but you have AI note takers in there, and it occurs to you, you don't know if they're paid or free. and then you didn't have that in the agreement, and you haven't just talked about it as a group. So essentially it already happened. There's sensitive information, and there were multiple AI note takers. So what's coming up on this one?
I guess I'm wondering if it's internal, what our responsibility as a coach is versus internal responsibility to be using the right tools that our company mandates.
Yeah, sure. I think some of the challenges, right, is that some companies have this mandated, but I feel like a lot of the stuff is changing so fast. So it may just be like what you're saying is the whole, like, if you see something, say something. Other thoughts?
I feel like ethically you would have to report this or let someone know. I'm just not sure who that someone is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the good news is internal. You'd probably at least be letting your leader know. I think the challenge is sometimes, like, I was hired by another coach, and it was so nice to have another coach in the organization with me. However, once that coach was no longer working there and I was the highest ranking coach, it was a bit more challenging. Because it was like, who do I talk to about this? And then am I also explaining what the ICF ethics are to this person? Other thoughts and questions? Yeah, that's a good point. Disclose to evaluate the risk. What about in the group itself? So let's say it sounds like there's agreement on we need to tell someone, so a leader in the organization, but this is already, we don't know if there's kind of a leak or not. Do you keep AI option in the session? Do you change it? Do you make an agreement about it? What are people's thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the agreement comes from multiple places. Whoever your major contract is with the organization, they need to know going forward what kind of AI and whether or not they're going to allow people in the session to have AI. In which case, if the organization says no note taking, no AI note taking, then that's easy. You just have everyone agree that they're not going to, they understand they can't use their AI note takers. If they do allow the AI note takers, as someone else mentioned, which ones do they allow? And then I would put it in the agreements just because I like to have everything spelled out as to what is allowed and make sure that everyone understands, setting those expectations of what they can and can't do.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Diana, is there a situation where if you had like a signed or acknowledged coaching agreement from each participant and you had a major change like this, would you go back and have them re-acknowledge it?
I think that's an interesting question and potentially an interesting tactic. I don't know that that's a standard. I don't know that that's a standard practice, but I think if, essentially if you're like, hey, this could have been, or it was a breach, it's going to make sense to talk about that. Yeah. Okay. So it's complicated. So if and when you're an internal coach or you're coaching within a company, you want to make sure that you are having those conversations with the company. However, be prepared with AI. They don't necessarily know, and they don't necessarily have a policy, or their policy is going to be blanket, like nothing. You can use nothing in there, which is fine. Or maybe you as a coach, if you are more kind of AI dependent, especially because, my team shares trends from group and team coaching. That's part of the value they get. It's part of the value that the sponsors get to see because they don't get to be in the session. So it might be something where you even put in your contract, like only my note taker will be present. The notes will be approved before they're disseminated, things like that. One of the things, though, I will say for myself, you might decide it's easier to just be like, no AI note takers, just be present and jot down your takeaways before you leave. So there's not a right or wrong here, which is part of what makes it challenging, because there's a lot of potential gray area. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to show you the last case study briefly. Then I will do closing announcements, and then I'm going to share a couple links with you in case you have more questions or anything for follow-up. So thank you so much for your engagement. And thank you for accommodating. I know we had a bit of a late start, so I'm happy to stay a couple minutes after. So if people have questions or anything like that, I can get to those. And then here's a number of links. I didn't grab the ICFLA full-length webinar. I think that's still available, but if someone is interested in learning more from an ethics perspective and you're not seeing that option on your dashboard, let me know. So there's just a bunch of links and stuff in there, and I'm going to give us our closing announcements and our ending code. So the last case study that we didn't get to that I'll just go over briefly was external. So it's a team with 5 levels of leaders from SVP to supervisor. You ask people on their intake if they have questions or concerns, and they say they don't. But then during the team engagement, a member of the team is terminated. So one of the things to think about from an ethical perspective, how does that change the dynamics? How does that change the agreement? What actually happened, and do you need to make space for that? They maybe know what happened and you don't necessarily. And then also, what does that mean? What does that mean? And this is one from my own experience. So this was challenging and complicated, but I also wanted to give something that wasn't just specifically confidentiality based, but also looking at, in team coaching, we're supposed to treat the team as a whole unit. And in this particular team, that unit changed. So just food for thought on this one. These slides are available in your dashboard along with the codes and the certificate. So let this one percolate a little bit. I'm happy to talk more about it if people want to discuss or linger after afternoon. Wanted to make time, so if you're able to linger for a couple minutes, any other Q&A, challenges, best practices, think about what you're taking away from this and what you might be able to use for this. There is an ethics hotline. So there's an email, there's a number you can call, there's a form, super helpful. I've met a couple of the people on the ethics board, and talked to someone on the ethics hotline, and just especially for me as an internal coach, there wasn't any huge ethical violation. It was just, I didn't know what to do. And I needed someone else that knew about ethics and ICF ethics to talk me through. So make sure you know about that as a resource. I represent Hawthorne Union. We have a bunch of free resources. We do teach classes on this, but if you check out our resource page, there's a bunch of stuff around building your business, but also around ethics. And then I have videos talking about this stuff. We come back together for group and team. On the 16th, we're doing assessments and AI with Marielle. Some of you have met her. So we're going to show you some team and group assessments and some cool AI tools. In November, we'll do a pricing panel and get coaches together talking about pricing. So if you have questions about pricing, let me know. That's a very common topic. And then I will be, after multiple years of this amazing group, I'm going to be stepping away as facilitator. So we are looking for a facilitator for the future. So if you're interested, I am happy to talk to you about that if we want to keep this SIG going. Thank you for your time and spending your time with me today. Have a great week, and I hope to see you in September.